Magandang hapon, mayapagat panapo na embagamalin, masanto siyangarem, marhay na hapon sa mga kapatid naman natin sa Visayas, maayong hapon, maupay nga kulop, maayong ugto, at sa mga kapatid natin from Mindanao, assalamualaikum, buenas tardes. At kung tayo naman po ay merong mga panauhing mga banyaga, good afternoon, anyong hasayo, konnichiwa, salamat siyang, Shan Wu Hao, and welcome sa ating regular na mga tagapakinig at tagapanood sa ating Facebook Live at dito rin sa ating Zoom. No? Welcome po sa ating lahat at mabuhay po tayong lahat. Ngayon pong hapon, napakapalad natin kasi ang ganda na naman ng ating topic. Very interesting na naman. Ano? Ito po ay napapanahon talaga dahil ito po ang ating ika-30 or 30th episode na ng ating Kamustahan para sa maganda, maayos, mabuti at makabuluhang kinabukasan ng ating isang oras ng the Filipino Sustainable Development Goals or ang ating SDG Action Hour. Ayan, nako, ang ganda na naman ng topic natin. Ito po ay may pamagat na diversification as a component of sustainable rice farming. Ayan, ang siguro mamaya malalaman natin, may pa ba tayong ibang pwedeng kainin aside from rice? Ayan, ang ating pong tagapaghatid o ang ating guest para sa hapon na ito ay eksperto po sa usaping ito at malugod niyang ibabahagi sa atin mamaya upang magkaroon tayo ng mas malawak na kaalaman. May iba pa po tayong pwedeng kainin bukod sa bigas. Sabi ko pa nga, nakapakapalad po natin tayo na pagbigyan ng ating napaka-busy na panauhin, no? Kasi siya po yung tinatawag na University of the Philippines Pride and Glory. Although retired na po siya, siya ay nagsilbi bilang isang profesor ng University of the Philippines Mindanao at siya po ay isa rin pong academicians ng National Academy of Science and Technology ng DOST. Siya po ay naging UP Board of Regents noong July 2020. Bago po siya nagturo sa UP Mindanao, siya po rin ay nagturo at naging professor sa UP Los Baños. At isa po siya sa mga galing na scientists in the field of agriculture. Ang kanya pong research at advocacy ay ang plant breeding, genetically modified crops, underutilized bioresources, sustainable modern agriculture, and rural transformation through science-based support system for rice farmers. Nako, hindi lang po yan. Ang atin pong panauhin ay naging author o siya po ang may akda ng aklat na nakatanggap ng award bilang Most Outstanding Book in 2008 at ito po ay may pamagat na The Unfolding Gene Revolution, Ideology, Science and Regulation of Plant Biotechnology. At isa pa po sa mga aklat na kanyang sinulat ay ang The Nipa Palm, Nature's Gift from the Age of the Dinosaurs na na-publish po noong 2011. Naku, parang gusto kong basahin yan. Hindi ko pa nabasa ito kasi merong The Age of the Dinosaur. Siya din po ay naging Executive Director ng the Philippine Rice Research Institute. Ay naku, mauubos po yung oras kapag lahat po ng awards niya ay banggitin ko. Pero exciting po ang ating topic for this afternoon. So simulan na po natin. Tawagin po natin at welcome at bigyan ng masigabong palakpak ang ating guest for this afternoon, Dr. and Academician Eufemio T. Rasco Jr. Ayan. Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon, Dada.
Yes, sir. Good afternoon.
Salamat sa iyong nakakatabang puso na introduction.
Hindi ko nga sir nabanggit lahat ng awards nyo. Parang 3 pages yata yung kaya hindi ko na binasa. So, sige po. Josh, I think you can share the screen for Dr. Rasco. Yes, sir. Later on po.
Yeah, but joking aside, Dada.
Opo. Yes, sir.
Joking aside, if I were a teacher and I'm to grade you sa iyong introduction, I'll give you 99%. Kasi may 1% na mali. Hindi
po yun?
Ako naging Board of Regents ng UP. Sana naging Board of Regents ako, pero hindi pa po. Sana sa...
Ay, nako, sayang. Ayaan niyo po,
okay.
Sir. Baka dumating din yung panahon na yun, sir. Ayan na po ang iyong screen.
Yeah,
Okay,
right.
later on, sir, merong mga
Okay.
questions po siguro na maisusulat sa Q&A box as a chat
Okay.
box po after your presentation. Go ahead, sir, and welcome again. Thank you, sir.
Okay. Yeah, before I start, I'd like to acknowledge the presence of my colleagues in the academy. I see in the chat box or in the participant list, National Scientist Lourdes Cruz, National Scientist Dolores Ramirez, Academician Ruben Villarreal, Academician May Mendoza, Academician Arnel Del Barrio, Academician Virginia Cuevas, and Academician Sep Maala. I also note the presence of Mr. Cesar Gomez, who is a colleague in the Coalition for Agriculture Modernization of the Philippines. Maraming salamat po sa inyong pagdalo sa aking webinar at sana ay huwag kayong umalis bago matapos. Magandang hapon po sa inyong lahat. Nagpapasalamat ako sa organizers nitong webinar, Future Earth program, dahil sa opportunity na ibinigay sa akin para may paliwanag kung ano ang lugar ng diversity sa sustainable rice farming. My presentation will be encompassing because it actually serves as a preview to a book that I'm presently writing. It's actually 8 years overdue. The title is The Inconvenient Truth About Rice. I will be arguing in this presentation that number one, monoculture rice is not sustainable. It perpetuates poverty among farmers, and it is a threat to the environment. Too much rice is unhealthy for consumers. Number two, monoculture is perpetuated by consumer demand and unfavorable government policy. Number three, diversification starting from the dining table to the farm is the key to solving the problems caused by monoculture farming. Number four, there are two distinct ways by which diversification can be achieved in rice farms. Direct, by targeting the farms, and indirect, by targeting the consumer. In my view, indirect and direct ways must be implemented in synchrony with the consumer taking the first step. Next slide. Next slide, please. Okay, it's a good coincidence that we are having this webinar 4 days after the International Day of Biological Diversity, which was last May 22. Oh, that was for 2020. Okay, 3 years ago. But the theme of this International Day for Biological Diversity is Our Solutions Are in Nature. This is a very profound statement that needs interpretation under our Philippine context. Next slide. Next slide, please. Okay, so if the solution, as the National Day of Biological Diversity says, if the solution is in nature, what is the problem? Well, the problem is large-scale monoculture of a few crops in the Philippines. If you look at the statistics today, we have about 13.4 million hectares of land suitable for growing crops, but 74%, or about 3/4 of this total area, is occupied by only 3 crops: rice, corn, and coconut. Of this, rice occupies about 3.7 million hectares. So that's more than a third of all the major crops. Well, this monocropping is actually a copy from the Western models of industrialization, which started about 200 years ago in Europe, and finally it was exported to America at kinopya din naman natin dito with the help of our colonial masters. Today, it's perpetuated by a highly influential industry lobby, namely those who are engaged in trading, processing, and supply of inputs. Kasi pag nawala ang monocropping ng rice, mabawasan ang rice area, then mawawalan sila ng negosyo. So this is a situation that is perpetuated not by the farmers themselves, but by those who are involved in the rice industry. There are attempts, or there were attempts by two major institutions to reduce monocropping, but this has not succeeded. The effort of the International Rice Research Institute that dates back to the 1970s consists of multiple cropping. They're trying to introduce growing crops after rice. And on the other hand, field rice has been involved in a program called Palayamanan, which actually supports diversification, but not only with crops. They tend to be they tend to cover other agricultural products as well: animals, mushrooms, and even fish and poultry. Next slide, please. Well, large-scale monoculture of rice is justified by, first, efficiency both in production, post-production, and marketing. This is primarily because in large-scale monoculture, mechanization is possible. Second, simplicity, owing to the specialization. If the farmer grows only one crop, then he only has to know that crop and everything that is associated with it. But if you add another crop or make it 3 or 4 crops, then the knowledge requirement is much more extensive, and the farmers may have difficulty in growing all the crops properly. Thirdly, with monoculture, there is no unfavorable interaction with other crops, such as competition for light, water, and nutrients. This happens when intercropping is done, and allelopathy can also be a problem in mixed cropping schemes. That is, one crop may negatively affect the neighboring crop because of chemicals that it may exude in the environment. If you grow livestock or poultry, then there is always the risk of physical damage, baka kainin ng baka or kainin ng kambing yung crops na tinatanim after rice. Number 4, the increasing demand for rice and the government policy of self-sufficiency. As the graph shows, you will note that between 1990 and 2009, there was a steady increase in consumption of rice in the Philippines, starting from about 80 kilos per capita to as high as 120 kilos per capita per year. In recent years, that is after 2009, the rice has eased up a bit, and I think the latest statistic shows us that the per capita consumption is in the vicinity of 112 kilos per capita per year. But this is still very high, considering that in the 1980s or 90s, our consumption was only 80 kilograms per capita per year. Next slide, please. So the next question is, if we continue rice monoculture, is this something that we can sustain? Well, my answer is no. And this slide shows you two reasons. One is from the economic point of view, and the second is from the environmental point of view. From the economic point of view, consider that the average rice farm is only about 1 hectare. And the profit from growing 1 hectare of rice is only about 60,000. So even if the farmer grows 2 crops a year, he only gets 120,000 per year from 1 hectare of rice. This is only half of what is considered as subsistence level for a family of 5, which is the average family size in the rice farm. Also, the economics, this calculation does not reflect the hidden cost. The hidden cost is, one of these is the cost of water. 1 kilo of rice will require up to 5,000 liters of water. So if you put a value into this water that is used per kilo of rice produced, then the price of rice will be very, very high, and no one can afford to buy it. On the other hand, the environmental argument against rice monoculture will consist of, first, the greenhouse gas emission, which has been documented to be a problem in the anaerobic conditions of the rice environment, which is favorable for the release of methane and nitrous oxide, both of which are very potent greenhouse gases. Third is soil degradation, and there are several aspects of this. With continued cultivation of rice, there could be micronutrient deficiency because the same species will be using the same pattern of nutrients, and after a while, some of the micronutrients specifically might become limiting. I'm referring specifically to nutrients like iron and zinc, which are now rampant, the deficiency of which is now rampant in rice areas. This, of course, will have an impact also on consumer nutrition if the rice crop has been grown under conditions of micronutrient deficiency. Second is the loss of nitrogen by denitrification and leaching, coupled with the sequestration of nitrogen fertilizer by the crop residue. And if you put this together, then the net effect is that you need more and more nitrogen fertilizer to get the same yield in rice. And in fact, this has been documented in many experiments. And lastly, the deterioration of soil physical properties, which may include the loss of the soil granules, the creation of a hard pan, which makes it difficult to grow another crop after rice. Next slide, please. The third reason why it may be sustainable is that we may be losing our farmers. The average rice farmer is 57 years old, and if you imagine a 57 years old still working in the farm, probably malnourished because he doesn't have enough to eat, and having problems with diseases that are associated with working in the rice farms, then you will be convinced that we have a problem of retaining farmers. In fact, it's very difficult for farmers to convince their children to pursue farming as a profession. Among the different threats to farmers' health is heat stroke, which is more of a threat in rice farms than, say, in coconut farms because the coconuts provide some kind of shade. But the rice fields are exposed to the sun, and also the farmer has to work long hours under the heat of the sun, growing the rice crop. Well, of course, the rice field is very favorable for the Philippine cobra, and in fact, there are many documented cases of rice farmers being a victim to snake bites. The submerged condition of flooded condition of the rice field is very favorable for schistosomiasis, which is a disease that is transmitted by snail, and you commonly find it common in rice fields. Working in the rice fields can be physically demanding. Sabi nga dun sa kantang Magtanim ay di biro, ay hindi naman makatayo, hindi makaupo kasi parating nakabend sa pagtatanim at sa pag-harvest. And this is particularly important now kung manual ang operation kasi yung ating mga modern varieties ay mga dwarf na. So mas kailangan mong yumuko during harvesting of this kind of varieties of rice. Of course, you can count chemical exposure to pesticides. And because of this, there have been documented cases of chronic kidney diseases of unknown etiology, CK DUT, which has been documented among rice farmers. The theory is that the prolonged exposure subjects the farmer to dehydration, which triggers the kidney disease. Lastly, there are documented cases of injury from operating machinery in rice farms. Next. Number 4, we have a problem with consumer health, particularly because of the recent trend towards high glycemic index varieties of rice. Mas gusto natin yung mga variety na medyo malagkit, and these are the varieties that have high glycemic index. Also, gusto natin yung palis na palis, ayaw ng brown rice. And again, this is the type of rice that has a high glycemic index. And lastly, we like to eat rice freshly boiled. And this is the kind of rice that has a very high glycemic index. It has been documented elsewhere that if you allow the rice to cool, put it in the refrigerator, then there will be some changes in the chemistry of starch, and you'll get a higher proportion of resistant starch, meaning that the glycemic index may be reduced. There are many scientific studies supporting the argument that eating white rice on a regular basis may actually increase the risk of type 2 diabetes. And the recent studies show that diets high in refined grain, meaning white rice, has been associated with an increased risk for premature coronary artery disease. Of course, we have always associated coronary artery disease with fats, but it seems that it's not necessarily the fats that are the culprits, but it could be refined grains, and that we are referring here to white rice. Next. Next slide, please. So, is rice monoculture sustainable? Number 5 argument is continued monoculture of rice will expose us to the risk of global warming. And this is primarily, as I mentioned, because of the greenhouse gas emission coming from the rice field. But the effect on rice will be severe. If we have too wet or too dry farming conditions, both of these are not exactly ideal for rice. Although rice prefers wet condition, our dwarf varieties may not be able to stand up to the floods that may occur because of global warming. Of course, when some parts of the country are too wet, the others may be too dry, and this is not good for rice. Also, with higher temperature and higher humidity because of global warming, we can expect a lot of pests of rice, and under monoculture conditions, this can spread very, very quickly, very difficult to manage. And lastly, talking now about the physiology of rice, very high temperatures, I'm talking here about temperatures exceeding 35 degrees centigrade, is not favorable for pollination, and grain filling is adversely affected when temperatures reach about 40 degrees. And right now, I think we're getting these kind of temperatures. On the positive side, now talking about the advantage of growing other crops or diversification, it has been documented that other crops like sweet potato will actually benefit from global warming or climate change. The rising level of CO2 may actually double the size of sweet potato. And also, if we switch to other crops like corn, adlai, and millets, then these crops have C4 types of photosynthesis, which is favorable for growing these crops under high temperature conditions. Next slide. Well, we are offering diversification as the nature-based solution to the problem of monoculture, but there are difficult man-made barriers to diversification. First among these is cultural. Somehow Filipinos cannot divorce themselves from rice. And the local market for rotation crops such as vegetables is very small. One senator, your favorite senator, Senator Villar, once advocated a ban sa only rice, but she had to be inhibited by the negative reaction, as you can see from this short video, which we got from the internet. Can you click the link, please?
Matapos mabatikos sa social media, nilinaw ni Senator Cynthia Villar na hindi niya iminumungkahing ipatigil na ang only rice promo ng ilang kainan. Opinyon niya lang daw ito at hindi naman niya gagawing panukalang batas. Makibalita tayo kay Lay Alves.
Sa mga simpleng karinderya, maging sa ilang kilalang restaurant, sure hit na pang-akit ang only rice. Paano ba naman sa isang ulam lang, sulit ang kabusugan, daanin sa extra kanin? Kaya sa pagdinig ng Senate Committee on Agriculture and Food tungkol sa rice importation, naging kontrobersyal ang pahayag na ito ni Senadora Cynthia Villar.
Masama yan. Pagbawal na natin yung unlimited rice. So, kasi nagkakasakit tayo gawa ng unlimited rice na yan. We should learn how to eat vegetables.
Ang mga only rice fans tuloy, halos mag-beast mode sa social media. Inaano raw ba ang senadora ng only rice? Ayaw daw nila sa only rice ban. Iba-iba naman ang opinyon ng ilan naming nakausap.
Ay, hindi ako papayag kasi ako hilig ko kumain sa only rice.
Siguro okay na din po yun para mabawas-bawasan yung mga na-overweight.
Sa panayam ng Super Radio DZBB, nilinaw ni Senadora Villar, hindi niya ipinapanukalang ipatupad ang isang Only rice ban. Kanya lang daw inilabas ang kanyang opinyon na masama sa kalusugan ang only rice.
Sinasabi ko lang po na eat rice in moderation for us to be healthy. Kasi nagiging sugar yung rice, nakakakos ng diabetes, napakarami pong diabetic sa Pilipinas.
Nag-post pa siya sa social media. Keep calm. There is no only rice ban. Sa datos ng Philippine Statistics Authority, ang bawat isang Pilipino nakakonsumo ng mahigit 122 kilos ng bigas noong 2015. Halos 2.5 kabanya ng bigas kada Pinoy. Ang konsumo ng Pinoy ng bigas, pataas daw ng pataas. Indikasyong nananatili itong staple food ng mga Pinoy. Ang kaso, may problema ba sa supply ng bigas? Sabi ng NFA, nasa 6 na araw na lang daw ang buffer stock ng bigas. Isang buwan na ang nakalipas matapos aprubahan ng NFA Council ang NFA importation, pero hindi pa rin gumugulong ang bidding na lalahukan ng exporters mula sa ibang bansa. Hinihintay pa kasi ang resolusyong pirmado ng NFA Council na nag-aaproba ng terms of reference o mga patakaran sa importation. Kaya ang mandato ng NFA na dapat ay mayroong 30 days buffer stock ang ahensya pagpasok ng Hulyo, malabong mangyari.
Talagang napakalipis na ng aming stock inventory sa mga warehouses namin. Talaga ini-stretch na lang namin yung stocks para mag-abot yung importation.
Ang pagtitiyak ng DTI, walang kakulangan sa supply.
Importante talaga yun ang i-prevent yung shortage. And sa kanya wala naman tayong shortage na nakita.
Kaya sa mga takaw mata, may paalala.
Sinasabi namin,
Okay, we can continue. Okay, masyadong controversial ito si Senator Villar, but among the different advocacies that she supports, this is one that seems to be the most reasonable in my mind. Oh, well, another barrier is water. Of course, you need water to grow any crop. And unfortunately, the situation with water is it's in the wrong place at the wrong time. In the NIIA serviced irrigation systems, there is a definite schedule of release of water, and this is timed with the need of rice. You cannot grow any other crop because the schedule is dedicated to growing rice. Secondly, we have a lot of rains, but we don't have facilities for collecting rainwater. Number 3, the government subsidies for rice is disincentive for diversification. Among this is free irrigation, free seed, fertilizer, pesticide, even machines, and lately even cash, yung huling binigay sa mga rice farmer ay 5,000 dahil bumagsak ang presyo ng bigas because of the importation. So with all these incentives for rice farmers, it will be very difficult for them to move to other crops. And lastly, there are technical problems associated with diversification. In the paddled soil of rice field, there is a limited option for crop diversification. And during the wet season, actually only rice can be grown in many rice areas because of the flooded conditions. Next. Next slide. Okay, now let's explore how do we achieve increasing biodiversity in the rice farm. First is a direct method, which is this is an idealized multi-tropic farming technology in the sense that it covers a lot of farm products. It integrates rice, azolla, duck, mushroom, carabao, producing milk, and earthworms. The arrows show you the path of these different products. Next slide. Next slide, please. Okay, the one that I showed you is an idealized version, but in practice, these are the existing commercial diversification systems in rice farms. What you can see at the upper left hand is corn growing after rice. Following is ducks grown with rice, then onion after rice, rice fish cropping system, and growing kangkong in the rice fields of Thailand and Indonesia sorghum beds. Next slide. Next slide. Okay, another direct way of increasing diversity in the rice farm without switching to other crops is ecological engineering, which is actually growing a combination of trap plants, repellents, host for natural enemies of pests, light and pheromone traps. This has been studied intensively both by IRI and the International Rice Research and the Philippine Rice Research Institute, and it has been shown to be quite effective in reducing pests in the rice fields. Next. Next slide, please. Another approach to increasing diversity in the rice farm is indirect, which is introducing minimal processing technology for diversification crops, particularly if they're seasonal, to assure the year-round supply and sustain consumer demand. Some of the accepted processing technologies are fermentation, like burong mustasa, freezing or refrigeration of onions, and drying of grains such as corn and mung bean. Next. Next slide. But in my mind, the most effective pathway to increasing diversity in the rice farm is to create demand, an indirect way, to create demand for products of diversified farming. This is a tall order because, as we have mentioned, there are cultural barriers, but we have shown, based on our experience with COVID, that changing consumer behavior can be achieved. And right now, we're doing this through the Flex PhD competition, where we are trying to develop an app that consumers can use as a guide in choosing the kind of food that is plant-based, diversified, and that will not only contribute to their health, but also to the health of the environment. Next slide. So, my take-home messages by way of conclusion. Number one, monoculture rice is not sustainable. It is bad for the consumer, the farmer, and the environment. Secondly, diversification is the solution offered by nature, but it is constrained by lack of consumer demand, government policy, irrigation, and technical constraints. Number three, pathways to diversification in the rice farms can be direct or indirect. And lastly, the indirect path, altering consumer behavior, is the key, but it will take a whole of society approach and at least one generation of sustained effort to achieve this change. Next slide. Next slide. So before we end, let me suggest that all of us can help achieve sustainable farming of rice lands if we can only change our eating habits. Use the Planetary Health Diet as a guide and use the Flex PhD app as a tool. It's forthcoming, and we will be awarding the winners in this competition by next month. Thank you very much for staying on, and I can respond to your questions.
Ayan, thank you so much. Nako, may isang virtual na mga palakpak dyan. Talagang marami tayong natutunan. Tingnan po natin, habang wala pa pong questions sa ating chat box at saka sa ating Q&A box, ako po may question, Academician Rasco, no? Are you suggesting po ba na yung ating mga farmers ay mag-shift into other to grow other crops other than rice? Kasi kanina nabanggit nyo kasi ang 1 hectare na tanim na rice, 60K lang yung parang kita ng farmers. Tama po ba yon? And then for a month, for a year, dahil parang mayroong dalawang cropping, 100K. Parang ganun po yung sinabi nyo.
Yes, 120.
Opo. 120K. So kung halimbawa po ba ang farmer ay mag-shift into other crops, like yung sinabi nyo, yung adlay, millet, and sweet potato. Yung adlay po, alam ko yan yung baka meron pong hindi nakakaalam dito na yung adlay, yan yung nilalaro namin nung bata kami, na parang ng damo, di ba? Yung ginagawa-gawa naming parang mga kwintas, di ba po ba yun yung parang maliliit na parang butil? No, yun po yung adlay, no? Tapos yung millet, nga
that's
po
true,
yun?
yes.
Yeah, pa yung millets na sabi nyo, sir?
Ano bang tawag doon sa
Sa Tagalog. Opo. Pero yung
Tagalog.
adlay kung siguro yung
But
mga medyo
that's
kasing edad.
traditional food in the Visayas. When the Spanish
Millet.
conquistadores came here, that's what they noted.
Is it a crop, sir? Kasi parang hindi ko pa yata na encounter yun.
Yes,
O baka
it's still
nakita ko
grown
na.
in some remote areas. It's no longer a major crop. Napalitan na nga ng rice because when
So
when
dati
rice
po,
was
sana makita natin yan, i-research
right,
natin kung ano
yung
yung
crop natin.
millet na yan. Yun lang po yung question ko, kung mag-shift ba yung farmers, kunyari ang tatanim nila yung adlay. Kasi alam ko nga, hindi na nga nabubuhay lang basta yung mga adlay na yan eh. Yung adlay or millets, syempre yung ating kamote, kikita po ba sila ng mas malaki as compared dun sa sinasabi nyong rice kung meron silang 1 hectare na lupa?
Okay, the answer is not that simple because there are many rice environments. Roughly, you can classify them as irrigated rice and non-irrigated rice or rain-fed rice. Under rain-fed condition, the farmer can be more flexible as long as he can get water. Maaring yung water may not be sufficient for rice, but surely it can easily support dryland crops like vegetables and legumes. So under this condition, provided that the farmers can be provided some kind of irrigation, then the farmer can actually combine so many crops throughout the year. But under the traditional irrigated conditions where the irrigation is controlled by NIA, for example, then it will be very difficult, and we'll really have to convince NIA to make their irrigation schedule more flexible, so that the farmers will have a choice of growing other crops aside from rice. But certainly, the impact on the income will be tremendous. If the farmer grows onion, for example, after rice, then the income will be a lot bigger, depending, of course, on the price of onion. But the current price level, milyonaryo na siya kahit
kaso po hindi onion yung nakakabusog eh. Napanood nga po natin dun sa video, no? Sabing ganon, nagagalit sila doon sa parang akala nila ibaban na yung Andy rice, no? Pero parang psychological na po ba lang yun na pag hindi rice yung kinain sa mga major meals natin, hindi nakakabusog. Parang ganun yung ng mga Pinoy di ba? So kahit nagaano karaming kamote ang kainin, parang it does not suffice, hindi na quench yung gutom, di ba? Para, ewan ko, psychological ba yun or what? Baka kahit gaanong karaming mais ang kainin, parang hindi pa rin siya rice, parang ganun. So, ano po ba natin kaya yung psychology ng ating mga tao na parang bawasan. Totoo, alam naman nila na nakakaya diabetes, pero alam niyo po ba yung aming mga elderly sa aming pamilya, bakit ngayon lang naman nila sinasabing diabetes ang rice? Dati naman hindi, parang ganon. So, ayun, natatawa si Doc M, ano? So, parang ano po ba, saan ba nagsimula tong ngayon lang? Sabi nila, dati, nung panahon namin, wala yung diabetes na yan. Ngayon, sinasabi daw nila yan dahil kukunti na lang ang rice natin. Parang yun ang sinasabi na, kaya kunyari na lang, naka-diabetes yan, okay, kumain ng rice. So, what can you say about that, sir?
Sige, address ko muna yung huling issue na nilabas mo, no, with regards to yung bakit ngayon lang lumalabas na bakit nung araw hindi naman lumalabas yan. Well, number one, yung rice consumption natin ay hindi naman ganun kataas as I showed in the graph. Noong 1990, ang consumption natin is only 80 kilos per capita per year. Ngayon ay tumaas up to 120, yung medyo bumababa na lately, ang average at 112 na. But that's still quite high. So that's number one. Secondly, yung preference natin for rice varieties has been changing. Noong mga 1980s, we prefer yung mga varieties na na mababa yung glycemic index. But nag-i-evolve yung ating taste. Gusto natin yung medyo malagkit. Yun yung mataas ang glycemic index. Plus the fact na nag-i-improve yung ating rice milling technology. Nagiging very efficient sila in removing all the nutritious part of the rice grain. So ang naiwan na lang ay starch, which can easily be converted into sugar as soon as you eat it. So for these reasons, talagang sa ngayon ay may problema tayo sa diabetes. Now, with regards to the other crops, it's true na merong mga cultural biases against corn and sweet potato, for example. They are considered as man's food, no? But one approach to solving this problem is to process them in a way that make them more acceptable. For example, a sweet potato, if you make it into fries, actually, I don't know if you have tried it, but to me, yung sweet potato fries is better than...
Yan pong siniserve ng ng Max restaurant.
Yeah, right. And secondly, if you can process into noodles, then it becomes food for the rich. Kasi yung noodles, sweet potato noodles, is considered a rich man's food in Korea. It's actually a delicacy in Korea. So not only that we can have an alternative food for ourselves, but there is also the possibility of exporting these kind of noodles to Korea. So processing might be a good approach. Yeah, right.
Okay. Sige, may mga iba pa akong questions dito pero babasahin ko muna yung nasa Q&A po natin. Sabi ni Mr. Andy Katulin, diversified cropping systems broaden the source of a farmer's food and income. It also increases their land productivity and minimizes unpredictable risks such as the buildup of pests and diseases common in rice monoculture. However, despite of these, Philippine farmers are still no sold on the idea. Hindi pa daw sila sold dun sa idea. How can we encourage them to do such? Ayan po.
Well, I mentioned that the first step should be done by the consumer. Kasi napakahirap sa farmer na halimbawa magtanim siya ng kamote expecting that he can sell all of it. Pagdating niya sa market, marami pala siyang kasabay na nagtanim ng kamote. Ang problema sa kamote, mahirap i-store. So, ang problema niya ay paano i-dispose yung kamoting yun. But if the consumer preference for kamote will create the demand for kamote, then the chance that he will overproduce will be much less.
Interesting.
So to me, as I said, the problem should be approached at the farm and at the consumer level. But it's a chicken and egg. Sino bang mauna? Mahirap yung farmer mauna kasi yun nga baka mamaya mag-overproduce siya, hindi niya maibenta and ma-discourage siya, balik siya sa rice. But if the consumer takes the first step, then the farmer will be encouraged to produce other crops.
Opo. Okay. From Academician Arnel Del Barrios, in the breeding program po daw for rice, are they considering rice varieties that have low glycemic index?
I'm not sure now because you see,
Sir, yun po bang brown rice ay low glycemic index?
okay, yung brown is not a variety of rice. You can actually make any kind of rice as brown rice. It depends on the milling process.
Okay.
If during milling you don't remove the bran, then it becomes brown rice.
Brown rice.
Any variety. Now, going back to the question of breeders, you see, one mantra of breeders is they need to provide or to develop varieties that the market wants. So kung gusto ng market ay mataas ang glycemic index, kung gusto ng consumer ay magpakamatay, ay bibigyan niya ng mga breeders, no? Because that's their job to supply what the market needs. That's why I said it has to come from the consumers. At sabihin ng consumer, ayaw ko na niyang mga malalagkit na rice. Mas gusto ko yung mga buhaghag, yung mga long grain rice na mas mababa ang glycemic index. Then the breeders
yung buhaghag pala.
So, what's true is hindi naman lahat ng rice may problema. And depende rin sa variety, depende rin sa processing method, and depende rin sa cooking method, as I mentioned. Na if you eat rice freshly cooked as what we want, then mataas ang glycemic index niya. Pero kung bahaw, mas mababa ang glycemic index.
Ay, bakit baligtad? Akala ko yung bahaw yun yung mas talaga po? Naku, gusto pa naman nating lahat mainit.
Experimentally na mas okay yung bahaw. So, lalo na kung gawin mong fried rice, with oil, lalong marireduce yung absorption ng starch. Plus, lalagyan mo ng bawang, which is another
maraming
nutrient.
Bawang, ayan.
Yeah, right. So, it's really a little bit more complicated.
Sir, meron po ba tayong problema sa post-harvest? Nabanggit mo kanina, mahirap i-store ang sweet potato o yung kamote. So, paano po ba, meron po ba tayong difficulty sa post-harvest natin? Meron ba tayong issue dyan? Yung mga, alam ko, yung mga produce natin, paano bang, yung mga regular farmer, ano pa ba yung post-harvest facility na meron sila? Or are they being supported by the DA on that?
Okay, yung root crops in general, that includes sweet potato and potato and cassava, they deteriorate more or less rapidly after harvest, unless you put them under a cold store. Secondly, there is always that problem of pests during storage. Which actually starts from the field. Kung yung sweet potato ay may weevil, yung tanga, di ba? Yung pag kinain, parang merong masamang lasa. That is caused by...
Yung ulalo ba yun?
Yeah, right. By the weevil infesting the roots. And tuloy-tuloy yan. Kahit na-harvest mo na yung kamote, ay tuloy pa rin ang infestation ng weevil. And it will spread to other kamote in storage shed. So it's it's quite complicated. You need to provide better pest control, and after harvest, provide some kind of refrigeration. But there are simple ways that have been developed by international centers of farm level storage without refrigeration. This, of course, can be adapted by farmers.
Okay. So, ang ganda po kasi din nung present nyo na yung pathways to increasing diversity in rice farming, no? So, meron kasama doon yung ecological engineering na sinasabi mo, sir, no? Mukhang maganda yon. Pero kakayanin po ba yun ng farmers na sila lang or kailangan talagang may support din from the government para ma-pursue nila yun?
Okay, yung ecological engineering requires planting different
Different,
species.
ano?
Yung mga species na usually ang tingin natin mga weeds, no? But for it to be sustained, number one, dapat may supply ng seeds. And at the moment, I don't know of anyone who is actually engaged in producing seeds of these crops that are used in ecological engineering. Secondly, the farmer must be willing to allocate some of the farm space for growing these weeds. And thirdly, may problema rin kasi yung normal practice ng farmer is to keep the rice fields weed-free kasi tataguan yan ng mga daga and other pests, no? So there may be problem with acceptability, which has to be sorted out. You have to have better rat control so that this can be accepted by farmers.
Okay. Ito po, merong question dito, sir, from Mr. Felino Lansigan. Good PM, Prof. Si Prof. Ino Lansigan po ito. Global warming affects rice farming adversely. Thus, there is need for developing and promoting climate-smart technologies. Example, planting date, nutrient manager, water management, etc. These technologies must be promoted extensively in the country. What do you think of this strategy? Thank you and regards.
Thank you, Dr. Lansigan. I'm familiar with your work sa Saray, and it's a very good approach to helping rice farmers. Yes, everything that you said can actually provide some guarantee that the farmer will not suffer too much from extremes of weather due to climate change. But again, we have to be aware of boundaries. No? Like I mentioned, 35 degrees and 40 degrees. 35 degrees for pollination and about 40 degrees for grain filling. So pag masyado ng mataas, even if you adopt all these practices, then the farmers will still suffer. Of course, there's some research on breeding heat-tolerant rice. In fact, may na-release ng at least one variety, ang Philippine Rice Research Institute, that can produce even at high temperature. Ito na breed under temperatures exceeding 65 degrees centigrade. So yung as far as pollination, hindi siguro problema with this variety. But again, you have to worry about grain filling when the temperature becomes very high.
Yeah.
So there's really no substitute to exploring other crops that are better adapted to high temperatures.
Yes, thank you, sir. May mga questions pa dito from Miss Annabel Surara. Ask ko lang po, may mga variants po ba ng palay para labanan ng El Nino at climate change? Pwede po pakipaliwanagan tungkol dito. At meron pa po siyang tanong para basahin ko na rin. Also, attainable po ba talaga ang 20 pesos per kilo? And kikita po ba ang ating mga farmers kung ibibenta ang bigas ng 20 pesos per kilo? Ayan po.
Okay. Yung adaptation to climate change, there are several aspects to this. One is increasing the of rice fields. this may happen in coastal areas. And one solution that has been proposed, and actually the technology is available, is to develop varieties that can be grown under this kind of condition. Ang lead researcher nito, yung isang academician natin, si Dr. Glenn Gregorio, when he was still working with the International Rice Research Institute. With regards to extreme dry conditions, there is a very active research again on rice varieties, and this is being pursued both by IRRI and Phil Rice. Meron na tayong mga varieties available that are tolerant to drought. And lastly, yung too much water, there are varieties, yung tinatawag nilang submarino, that can be grown under extreme, too much water conditions.
Ayan. So,
the
merong...
approach is variety. In fact, that's the cheapest approach.
Ayan, meron pa po siyang pahabol eh. Pa-update din po regarding technique to conserve water in rice farming.
Okay, before I answer that, let me address yung 20 pesos per kilo rice.
Ayun.
Once I made some calculation na maybe we can get it at about 22 pesos, but not 20. How? Well, if the consumer will buy palay directly from the farmer, then he will probably pay about 17 pesos or so. Then if he milks it using the brown rice mill, then the recovery will be 10% higher than the usual recovery. So kung ang usual recovery ay 60%, then you can get 70% recovery with brown rice. So the trick is for the consumer to buy directly from the farmer and then mill it herself, or perhaps through a consumer cooperative that can do the milling. So in other words, the added cost from the farmer to the supermarket can be saved through this process. But of course, if you persist on buying from the supermarket, it will be very difficult unless it is subsidized by the government.
Yes, thank you, sir. Here's another question from Dr. Sasitara Moreno of Aliaga Rice Corporation. We have water crisis with water irrigation in UNIID-SEA. What can we do to help the farmers? Next harvesting season, there will be many who could not farm because of lack of water.
Well, I think my talk gave the answer. Grow other crops, those that require less water. Because as I mentioned, you need a lot of water to grow rice, as much as 5,000 liters per kilo. But if you grow other crops, you will probably use 30% or less of the water. But if you persist on growing rice, there are technologies that are available. But again, this depends on cooperation of irrigation agencies like NIA. The one solution is alternate wetting and drying, so that you don't keep the rice field under more or less permanent submerged condition. So you can save a lot of water that way. It's been shown experimentally that you don't actually lose so much yield.
So ano po yun? Dalawa, sabi nyo, wet
alternate wetting and drying.
Wetting and drying. Okay.
Yes.
Yes, ayan. I think nasagot naman lahat ng ating mga tanong. I'm sure na marami pang siguro mga tanong na nasa isip hindi lang talaga nila mai-voice out. Pero sir, Academician Eufemio, ang dami niyo pong naipartake sa amin na information na talagang makakatulong. Sana hopefully sir, pagbalik nyo, you talk more about yung iba pang klase ng mga tawag dito na mga products or produce na pwede nating ipalit nga sa rice, ano? So, ito, may pahabol sa tayo magano. Reaction po. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Kanina pa ako nagpapahiwatig eh. Hindi
Ay, sir, hindi ko nakikita. Sorry, sir. Yes, sir. Doc M, go ahead.
Well,
Sorry.
okay. First of all, I would like to congratulate Dr. Rasco for very excellent presentation. Dong, ang suggestion ko, maybe let us approach our crop science head that your lecture can be an excellent beginning lecture in our crop science 1B. O ano, 1A ba yun o 1B? Ang ganda-ganda, very good introduction for diversification. The pros, the cons, and the beautiful experiences you presented. All right, next, I would like to share my experience. Many years ago, talagang matagal na, when Jollibee was starting, I was approached by yung presidente, nakalimutan ko na pangalan. Ang tanong sa akin, Dr. Villarreal, since you are here at the College of Agriculture, can you suggest how to go about with the use of white potato, meaning yung patatas? Dahil at that time yata para nagkakaproblema sila. Ang sagot ko, simpleng-simple. Alam mo, hindi pa ginagawa, but you can explore to use sweet potato as yung isineserve sa halip ng patatas. Well, fortunately or unfortunately, yung problema ng supply ay nasolve. At any rate, fast forward. I share this with my colleagues in the United States that maybe the sweet potato can be used also by McDo and other companies selling ano. Alam mo, later on sa Amerika, marami na ring restaurant na sa halip ng patatas, ang ginagamit ay sweet potato. At ang ginagamit nila ng sweet potato ay yung orange flesh sweet potato. Pero dito sa atin, hindi masyado nag-take off. But in America, they are now using it in a number of restaurants. So I thought I cannot help but share that information. Thank you.
Oo. Thank you, Academy. Sorry, hindi ko po kayo nakikita kanina. Anyway, so, yes, Academician Eufemio, ano po ang ano nyo?
Yeah, I was reacting to the sweet potato thing. I think I failed to mention earlier that while this fried sweet potato might be a good option, we have to be aware that in practice, our restaurants reuse the oil that is used for frying. And they use the type of oil that can easily produce toxic components when heated. So it's better that it's done at home, where you can perhaps use the coconut oil, which is more resistant to the kind of chemical process that I mentioned, and don't reuse the oil.
Thank you, Dong. Absent ako na ituro yon.
Maraming salamat, Academician Ruben. Naku, don't reuse the oil. Ang mahal kasi ng oil. Ay, last na lang to, pahabol. Ano reaction nyo daw po, sir? Sabi ni Miss Annabel Surara. Ano yung reaction nyo regarding digitally aided seed distribution? Makakatulong daw po ba ito sa mga farmers?
I'm not sure what you mean by digitally aided seed
distribution.
Yeah, seed distribution.
Sa pagtatanim to, sir, yung hindi ko rin alam pero parang
distribution ng seeds for planting or well, you can use many tools to make it easy for say the government to determine where a seed is needed and be able to mobilize supply to respond to these needs. yeah, that will be helpful if we have some kind of information which is easily available, digital information easily available, so that the seed producers, including the government, will know where the seed is needed.
Parang sinasabi niya, sir, yun daw mga binhi ay padala system. Parang electronic padala system, something.
Okay. Yan, through itong e-commerce.
Parang ganun siguro. Seed program daw po ito, sabi niya, sir.
Yun ang pinaka madaling paraan, but then again, the cost of transport might be a constraint. So actually, it's much better to grow the seed closer to where it's needed. So it requires some kind of planning. This area will require this much seed, so we'll have to grow the seeds in an area close to this, an area that is suitable for seed production. But that is with open pollinated seed. With hybrid seed, then we may have a problem because the environmental requirement for growing hybrid seed is different from the environmental requirement for growing open pollinated seed. So there are not too many areas that are suitable for hybrid seed production in the Philippines today.
Hindi ko paintindihan yung electronic na ipapadala. I couldn't understand that because as of now, seed companies send their seed samples to be given to Gawad Kalinga to me in packages. Mga nakakahon na yun, dumadating dito sa bahay. Sabi, Dr. Villarreal, ito po yung seed para sa DK. So, ano ibig sabihin yung electronically sending seed? Paano yun?
Well, perhaps she's referring to the use of digital technology as an aid in seed distribution. So it's really a matter of information where varieties. Kasi you have to match yung volume and variety requirement with farmers. The worst thing that can happen is you produce so many tons of variety A, pero ang gusto pala ng farmer ay variety B. You have a lot of seed of the wrong variety. So yeah, you need that kind of technology as an aid for planning ng mga seed producers as well as the farmers themselves.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Dr. Rasco, ano kaya ang pwedeng itanim na crops, vegetables side by side with rice without affecting rice productivity? Yun ang magandang added income.
May technique sila sa Indonesia which Phil Rice has studied under local conditions. Yung sinasabi nilang Sorjan beds. No? So it's actually raised beds. You can grow dryland crop on raised beds, and between raised beds ay flooded, and you can grow rice. So it's intercropping.
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 Kasi in that way, while waiting for yung sa rice, mayroong source of income ng farmers na kung may pwedeng vegetable or any crop that is planted in between yung rice. So matagal-tagal din yung hintayin yung rice na mag-seeds or may talagang additional source of income ng farmers. Hindi lang yung intercropping or after harvesting rice din saka magtanim ng ibang crops. So ang idea ko ay marang may tanim na pagkakakitaan ng farmers while lumalaki, hinintay natin yung rice.
There are crops that are short season. No? It requires maybe 4 weeks, 5 weeks. And I'm referring to kangkong, pechay, and similar crops na
Mustasa.
mas actually mas profitable kaysa sa rice. So by the time you harvest rice, milyonaryo ka na because of the other crops.
Parang wala
In fact,
yata tayo, sir. Sir, parang wala tayong mga
yung
farmers na
ibang
milyonaryo.
well, hindi sila nagmo-multiple cropping.
Oh. Ay,
Sa-
nako,
sa
naku,
ilang
alam
po,
niyo po ba, sir? Sobrang nag-overtime na tayo ng 23
overtime na
minutes.
ba?
Hindi natin napansin yung oras kasi napakaganda ng topic natin for this afternoon. But we are hoping, sir, na ma-invite pa namin kayo sa second round, sir, no? So we hope na magkaroon tayo ng part 2 nito, sir. But for the meantime, we would like to thank you, sir. Alam namin napaka-busy ka, but binagbigyan mo kami dito sa aming SDG Action Hour na ito. And we're hoping that we can invite you again next time para sa second round na sana naman po ay mapagbigyan nyo kami uli. So, from FEP, maraming pong salamat. And from NAST, thank you so much, sir. And nagpapasalamat po kami sa lahat ng mga viewers natin sa Facebook Live. Gayon din po dito sa Zoom. And we hope to see you again next Friday para sa another 1 hour of exciting discussion na naman ng mga napapanahong topic. So, at this point, gusto na nating mag-close, pero...
Sandali,
yes,
sandali,
sir.
bago mo sira. Pakicheck mo nga, either baka na yan ang problema. Every time na sasali dito, hindi na lumilito yung picture ko. Dati lumilito yung charming kong picture.
Oo nga po, kaya hindi
walang
kayo
palagi.
nakita.
Every time na. So I don't know, is the problem from my side or from yung nag-control
Sir, sa
siya?
ano nyo po yan? Doon po, sir, sa camera nyo. Sa camera po nyo. Opo, sir. Meron po kayong ano dyan, baka po, may dalawang klase po kasi ng cameras na nagagamit sa Zoom. Baka po yung isa po ay hindi applicable para sa Zoom camera.
Sige.
I-check nyo, pa-check na lang po, sir, yung camera nyo.
Okay, pagpunta ni Dr. Rasco dito, tatanong ko.
Okay, so...
Okay, thank you very much, Dada.
Marami
Thank you,
pong
thank
salamat, sir. Oo nga naman, sabi ni Miss Annabel Sorara, ang gwapo mo pa naman, sir, hindi kayo nakikita.
Hindi naman po ako. Charming lang.
Ayun. So maraming salamat po and thank you again for this 1 hour episode.
Ma'am Dada,
Yes po, Doc M. Kayo po ba yun?
Ma'am Dada kasi yung lumalabas pag yung hindi lumalabas yung picture namin, the host has parang close yung yung
hindi po ako
video
yun.
namin.
Hindi po ako yun. Yung amin po sigurong ayan guys. I-open nyo daw ang mga videos nila, ha? Kasi ako din kasi, sir, pagbasok ko ng sa Zoom, hindi ko rin po mabubukas ang ko, nire-request ko po sila na ibukas. So, Josh, did you hear that?
See. Okay.
Josh, are you there? Did you hear that? Hindi daw nila na, all panelists po, may permission po to open. Hindi daw po yan. May permission daw po kayo to open your video. So, next time.
Hindi na malaman kung paano buksan.
Pakalam po.
Okay.
Anyway, marami pong salamat uli. Yung ating pong evaluation form nandyan po sa chat box. And thank you so much. Ako, Academician Eufemio T. Rasco Jr. Thank you so much. At kahit po nag-overtime tayo, marami tayong natutunan. And hope to see you again next Friday for another exciting discussion. Thank you. God bless us all.